I have been a student at the Galactic Academy of Unified Sciences for 3 standard years now. In that time, I have sat through lectures delivered by beings with 6 arms, attended seminars where the instructor communicated entirely through color shifts in their skin, and once sat next to a creature that breathed methane from a personal tank and still somehow managed to answer every question before the rest of us had even finished reading the prompt on the holodisplay. I have seen a lot of things at this academy. I thought I had seen everything. I was wrong. What happened on the 43rd day of the autumn cycle in Professor Cale Vorith's Advanced Threat Assessment and Survival Theory class, I'm going to try to tell it properly. I'm going to try not to leave anything out. Because people keep asking me, and most of the accounts floating around the campus datanet are either exaggerated or completely wrong, and that girl deserves for the real version to exist somewhere. So here it is. Let me start with the room itself, because the room matters. Lecture Hall Sigma 9 is the oldest active classroom on the Veyron 4 campus, built during the early years of the Academy's founding, before the newer wings went up with their climate-adaptive walls and personalized atmospheric pods for different species. Sigma 9 is old school, literally. The seats are fixed in concentric semicircles, tiered upward from the lecture floor, so everyone in the room has a clear sightline to the front. The walls are dark gray composite material, the kind that absorbs sound and makes footsteps seem hushed. There's a faint hum that never quite goes away, something to do with the ventilation system trying to balance oxygen, nitrogen, and 3 other atmospheric needs simultaneously. The lights are always set slightly colder than comfortable. Not freezing, just a ½ degree below where you want them, enough to keep you alert. Professor Vorith chose this room deliberately. He said so the first day of class. He stood at the front with both his upper arms crossed and his lower pair hanging loose at his sides, a stance the Drivari use when they want to project calm authority, and he looked around at all 46 of us and said, in that voice like grinding gravel over stone, "The discomfort you feel in this room is the point. You will not learn threat assessment while you are comfortable. Comfort is the enemy of survival. We begin." That was the whole introduction. No syllabus overview. No icebreakers. Just that, and then 3 hours of the most brutal threat scenario analysis any of us had ever sat through. By the end of week 1, we understood what kind of class this was. By week 3, we understood what kind of instructor Vorith was. He was, without question, the most demanding professor on the entire campus. He held a Drivari military rank equivalent to what humans would call a general, not honorary, actual service record, actual campaigns, actual scars visible on the left side of his neck where the plating had been damaged in something he never discussed. He had been recruited to the academy as part of an exchange program with the Drivari Defense Network, brought in specifically to teach species from across the Galactic Coalition how to think under pressure. His methods were simple. He put you in a scenario, real or simulated, and he pushed. He pushed until you either answered correctly or you broke. Most students broke first. He was not cruel about it. That's important to say. He wasn't sadistic. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He genuinely believed that the only way to train a mind for high-stakes situations was to find its breaking point during a low-stakes one, in a classroom, not in the field. He'd said as much, multiple times. I would rather you fall apart in front of me than in front of something that will kill you. Fair enough as far as philosophies go. Still, he was intimidating in a way that went beyond the physical, and the physical was already significant. Drivari are large. Professor Vorith stood at roughly 2.5 meters, covered in natural dark gray armor plating that shifted slightly with his breathing, four-armed, with a facial structure that read as severe to most other species, heavy brow ridges, eyes set deep and slightly luminescent in low light, a jaw that looked capable of breaking things it had no business breaking. When he moved through the lecture hall between rows of students, it felt, I don't have a better word for this. It felt like weather. Like a front moving through. Most of us had learned to answer his questions quickly, even if we weren't sure, because a fast wrong answer got corrected. A slow wrong answer got dissected, and the dissection was thorough and unforgettable. The class was 46 students from 22 different species. Humans were underrepresented as they often are in academy technical programs. 3 of us in total that semester. Myself, Orvith Maldine, Ceruvian, 3rd year. A quiet Terran male named Brassic who sat in the back and rarely spoke. And her. Myra Solis. Human female, somewhere in her early 20s by human reckoning. She sat in the 4th row, left center, which was not coincidentally one of the seats with the clearest view of both the front display board and the main door, a positioning choice I noticed early on and suspected was not accidental. Humans at the academy had developed a habit of sitting near exits, which was not cowardice, as some of my peers initially assumed, but something else entirely. Something I came to understand better after the 43rd day. Myra was, I want to describe her accurately, because how she looked and carried herself is part of the story. She was not tall, even by human standards from what I understood. Medium height, slight build. Dark hair she kept pulled back in what humans call a braid, the kind that stays neat for hours and then starts coming apart in small ways toward the end of the day. She had what I later learned humans describe as an olive complexion, and dark eyes that had a quality I found difficult to name at first, not intensity, exactly. More like depth, like she was always looking at something slightly further away than whatever was in front of her. She was quiet in class, not shy, that's the wrong word. She participated when called on, answered clearly and without excessive qualification, and then went back to her notes. She didn't volunteer often. She didn't posture. Several of my classmates had initially interpreted this as disengagement or, worse, as a kind of low-level fear, the assumption being that the lone human girl was keeping her head down to avoid the professor's attention. I had a different read on it. I thought she was watching, taking it all in, filing things away. I would turn out to be right, though I didn't know yet how right I was. The 43rd day began the way most days in Sigma 9 began. We filed in between 7 and 7:15 standard. The ventilation hum was present, as always. The lights were at their usual slightly too cold setting. The holodisplay at the front was dark. Vorith never preloaded his slides. He built the lecture in real time, pulling data and scenarios from his own memory and the Academy's archived case files as he went. It kept you from preparing. It kept you from knowing what was coming. I took my seat. 3rd row, right center. I liked a slightly elevated angle on the display. Brassic was already in the back, doing something on his personal datapad with his head slightly bowed. 3 rows ahead of me, Myra was settling in, setting her notes on the desk surface, rearranging them in a small, quiet way that I recognized as her getting comfortable without making it obvious she was getting comfortable. The room filled steadily. Galvin twins from Sector 11 in the 2nd row, both wearing their atmospheric adjusters. A Theric male named Das in the front, who always sat right up front to compensate for his species' weaker low-light vision. A cluster of Meridian students in the upper rows, several of whom had been openly speculating in the corridor that this was the day Vorith was going to run a live simulation. They'd heard something from a 3rd year who claimed to know. They were wrong, as it turned out, but they had the right instinct that something unusual was coming. Vorith arrived at exactly 7:20, always exactly 7:20. He came through the side entrance rather than the main door, another deliberate choice, I had concluded, because it meant he was inside the room and at the front before most students fully registered he'd arrived. He said nothing on the lectern. He turned to face us, arms loose at his sides, all 4 of them, and waited the 3 seconds it took for the room to go completely quiet. Then he said, "Threat assessment. Final practical theory block before your midterm simulations. Today we discuss the single most dangerous variable in any survival scenario. He turned to the holodisplay and pulled up with one hand a rotating three-dimensional graphic, not a planet or a ship schematic, a silhouette, a generic humanoid outline, bipedal, bilateral symmetry, medium build. The unknown actor, he said, the being in the room whose capabilities you have not assessed. Today's question: how do you evaluate threat potential in a species you have never encountered, have no data on, and cannot predict? There was a small collective adjustment in the room, everyone sitting slightly straighter. This was the kind of question he gave when he was planning to go somewhere uncomfortable. He turned from the display, let his gaze move across the rows, slow and deliberate, the way he did when he was choosing. We have a useful resource in this room, he said. A species that the galactic community has less than 60 standard years of formal data on. A species that arrived at coalition negotiations barely 2 generations ago. A species that, by most standard metrics of technological development, galactic cultural integration, and biological specialization, ranks near the bottom of any comparative analysis. The room was very still. He was looking at the left side of the 4th row. Cadet Solis. Myra looked up from her notes. Her expression did not change. Yes, Professor. Stand, please. She stood, and I want to note something here that I noticed in the moment and that I think is important. She didn't hesitate and she didn't rush. Both of those things, the hesitation and the rushing, are fear responses. What she did was just stand at a normal pace, the way you'd stand up to answer a question you had already thought about, which, as far as I could tell, she hadn't had the chance to prepare for. You are human, Vorith said, and there was nothing cruel in his voice, but there was something deliberate in the way he stated it, like he was cataloging a fact for the benefit of the room. Yes, Professor, she said. Your species, he continued, turning slightly to address the broader class while keeping her visible in his sightline, is, by any objective measure, among the weakest of the Coalition's member species. Correct. He wasn't asking her. He was asking the room. Several heads nodded. A Meridian student in the upper rows made a small sound of affirmation that wasn't quite polite. Vorith returned his full attention to Myra. You have no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced sensory array. Your atmospheric tolerance is narrow. You are not particularly fast. You are not particularly strong. Your healing rate is average at best and catastrophic in worst-case scenarios. You have been a spacefaring civilization for less than a century, which in galactic terms is. He paused, and I believe the pause was intentional. Negligible. The word landed in the room like something dropped on a stone floor. Several students looked at Myra. I watched her face. Nothing changed. Her eyes were steady, looking at the professor. Given all of this, Vorith said, and now I could hear it, the pedagogical engine revving up, the setup completing itself for whatever the actual question was going to be. Given this species profile, given these limitations, given this history, why, in your assessment, should any galactic military strategist consider the human species a significant threat variable? He stepped forward, down from the lecture floor onto the first riser, closer to her. And I am asking you specifically, Cadet, because you are the subject, because you sit in this room representing every one of the limitations I just outlined. So I want you to convince me, convince this class. Tell me why you, biologically unimpressive, technologically young, physically unremarkable, should be taken seriously. He stopped at the edge of her row. If you can. The last 2 words were the sharpest part, not a volume thing, just the implication in them, the suggestion that she couldn't, that this was a test she was expected to fail, not because he was malicious, but because failure was the data point he was after. The class needed to watch a human attempt this answer and see where it broke down. That was the lesson. I genuinely believe he expected her to struggle, Most students struggled with direct challenge presentations in his format. You're put on the spot, you're told you're weak, you're told to defend yourself. That's a complicated psychological position to be in. Most beings, regardless of species, need a moment. They stammer, they ask for clarification, they head. Myra did none of those things. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds. I counted later from the classroom recording 3 seconds, which is actually not a very long time at all, but which felt in that moment like it had weight. And then she spoke. "Professor Voreth," she said, "with respect, you've just made my argument for me." The room shifted. Not dramatically, just a small collective readjustment, like everyone in the room leaning half a centimeter forward without realizing it. Voreth did not move. His expression did not change. Dravari facial plating doesn't allow for the full range of movement some other species have, so reading them requires knowing what to look for. But I was watching him carefully, and I saw his lower arms, which had been hanging loose at his sides, become very slightly still. Like something in him paid attention to that sentence in a way he hadn't quite anticipated. "Explain," he said. She did. "You listed our limitations," Myra said. Her voice was calm, not performatively calm, not the kind of calm that's actually tension wearing a mask, just genuinely level, like she'd thought about this before. Maybe not this specific question, but this specific territory. No armor, no venom, narrow atmospheric range, slow development curve, and you're right. All of that is accurate." She paused. "Now let me tell you what you left out." Voreth said nothing, which, in a Voreth class, was basically an invitation. "We don't have armor," she said, "because we never needed it in the same way. We developed tools instead. When something could hurt us, we didn't evolve a shell, we built one. And then we improved it. And then we made it mobile. And then we made it shoot back. That's not weakness. That's a different evolutionary strategy, and it means that the ceiling on our protection is not biological, it's technological, which means it's unlimited." She let that sit for a beat. "We don't have venom, but we figured out chemistry. We understand poison in detail at the molecular level. We've been weaponizing biochemistry for thousands of years. We don't need to produce it in our bodies. We make it in labs. And the things we make in labs are a lot more targeted and a lot more scalable than anything a venom gland can produce. Our atmospheric range is narrow," she continued, and her voice was starting to take on a rhythm now, not faster exactly, but more continuous, like someone who has opened a door and is walking through it rather than standing in the threshold. "We need a fairly specific oxygen-nitrogen mix to survive. You're right. But we've been living outside that range for generations now, in suits, in ships, in habitats. We've made our atmospheric limitation into an engineering problem, and we've gotten very good at engineering. Ask any species what it's like to fight an enemy in full environment suits. The suits are good. We've had a long time to perfect them." Voreth had not moved. "Healing rate," she said. "Average to poor," you said. "Also accurate. We die from wounds that some species walk away from. We always have. And that." She paused here, and this pause was different from the earlier 3-second pause. This one was deliberate. She was choosing words. "That is the reason we are dangerous, in a way that nothing in your lecture notes can fully capture." The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system clearly. "Every species that evolves in a hard environment develops some kind of response to mortality. Some of you grow armor. Some of you develop faster healing. Some of you developed pack defense systems where the group survives even if individuals don't. We did something different. We became, and this is not a metaphor, this is documented behavioral trait analysis. We became genuinely, functionally afraid of dying. Not paralyzed by it, not broken by it, but afraid of it in a way that shaped everything we do. We built medicine because we die easily and we don't want to. We built weapons because we're afraid of predators and we wanted them to be more afraid of us. We built navies and armies and intelligence networks and entire defensive doctrines. All of it. Every bit of it. Because somewhere in the back of every human mind, from the time we were building fires in caves to the time we were launching ships into orbit, there was this one quiet voice saying. She paused again. Not today. The silence after that was not the polite silence of a classroom waiting for the next thing. It was a different kind. The kind that happens when a room full of people all have the same thought at the same time, and none of them say it out loud. Myra wasn't done. You said we're technologically young, less than 100 years in space, 60 in formal coalition contact. You said that's negligible in galactic terms and in raw time measurement, yes. But look at what we did in those 60 years. Look at the rate of development. We came to our first coalition negotiation in ships that were, compared to what was already out there, barely functional. And in 60 years we've closed gaps that took other species 3 centuries. Not because we're smarter, not because we're better, because we're hungry in a way that's hard to explain from the outside. Every generation of humans alive today grew up knowing they were behind, knowing that the galaxy was bigger and older and more powerful than anything on their home planet. And that knowledge didn't make us retreat. It made us push. Because that's what the fear of being left behind does to us. It makes us run. She let out a breath, small, barely perceptible. You asked why you should consider humans a significant threat variable. The answer is this. Because we are a species that took the worst possible starting conditions, fragile bodies, slow development, narrow survival range, and responded to every single one of those disadvantages not by accepting them, but by refusing them. We are 60 years into galactic contact, and we are already running military programs at this academy that are producing graduates across every major field. We are 60 years in, and we've already had humans serve on 3 different coalition operations in combat-adjacent roles where they were the deciding factor. We are dangerous, Professor, because we don't know how not to be, because the alternative for us has always been death. And we have a very old, very specific, and very well-practiced relationship with not dying. She stopped. The room was silent. And then she said, quiet enough that it almost felt like she was saying it to herself more than to anyone else. We're also really good at being underestimated, which I think you just demonstrated. I want to stop here and describe what happened in those next few seconds, because I want to get it right. Professor Voreth was standing at the edge of her row. He had not moved since she started speaking. For a Drevari, a species whose default mode of intimidation involves slow, deliberate movement and the strategic occupation of space, being genuinely, completely still is not a neutral posture. It's a tell. It means something got through. He looked at her. She looked back. The room held its breath. And then Professor Kale Voreth, Colonel, former commander of the Drevari 8th Strategic Analysis Division, recipient of 3 coalition commendations, a being who had, in my 3 years at this academy, never, not once, given a student an unqualified acknowledgement in class, said 4 words. Sit down, Cadet Solis. And then, after a pause that seemed to have weight. Well argued. He turned back to the front of the room without another word. He pulled up a new display. He began the next section of the lecture, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But it had. It absolutely had. And everyone in that room knew it. The rest of the lecture that day was technically about non-standard threat assessment. Classification systems for species with unusual capability profiles. The mathematics of unpredictability as a force multiplier in tactical scenarios. Good material, well delivered. Nobody was really thinking about it. What everyone was thinking about, what I was thinking about, what the Galvin twins were exchanging small, significant looks about, what even the Meridian students in the upper rows had gone a bit quiet about, was the 4 minutes and some change that Myra Solis had just stood in front of 46 students and a professor who had spent decades studying threat and conflict, and made the case for her entire species with nothing but the contents of her own head. No notes, no prepared material, no backup. Just a clear mind and the willingness to stand there and use it. After class, the room emptied with the usual scattered pace, some students leaving quickly, some hanging back to compare notes or discuss the lecture content. I stayed in my seat for a few minutes, genuinely trying to process what I'd just watched. Brassic came down from the back row and sat in the seat next to mine, which he almost never did. "Did that just happen?" he said. "Yes," I said. "The Meridian students are already putting it on the campus net." "Of course they are." We watched the room thin out. Myra had gathered her things methodically, the same way she'd unpacked them, small, organized movements, and was making her way toward the main door. Galvin, the taller of the twins, Vesa, stopped her near the exit and said something I couldn't hear. Myra smiled, a small, real smile, and said something back. They stood there for a moment talking, and then Myra left. I would catch up to her in the corridor outside. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to say something. I'm not a naturally gregarious being, Ceruvians aren't, as a rule, but I had just watched something that I thought deserved acknowledgement from someone who had been paying attention. She was at her locker alcove, halfway down the corridor when I reached her. "That was impressive," I said. She looked at me. The depth in her eyes was present as always. "Thanks," she said simply. "Were you ready for that? Did you know he was going to?" "No," she said, "not specifically." She clicked her locker closed. "But I've been thinking about that question for a long time. Not because of this class, just." She considered. "People make assumptions about humans, especially here where we're new and small and everybody else has been doing this for centuries. It's not malicious, usually. It's just the data supports it if you only look at certain data. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the other data." She shouldered her bag. "The part nobody mentions, because it makes us harder to dismiss." I thought about that. I still think about it. "Do you think Vorith planned it?" I asked, "as a lesson?" She considered again, longer this time. "Maybe partly," she said. "He's not malicious. You know that. He was making a real pedagogical point about unknown variables. He just..." She paused. "Picked the wrong unknown variable." And then she was moving down the corridor, unhurried, the braid coming slightly apart at the end the way it always did by mid-morning, and I stood there and watched her go and thought, yes, that is exactly what happened. He picked the wrong unknown variable. The recording of that class, the segment from the moment Vorith called her name to the moment he said, "Well argued," was, as Brassic predicted, on the campus datanet before the day was out. By the following morning, it had been shared to the main Academy wide access board. By end of week, it had crossed into the broader coalition academic network. Several xenosociology researchers apparently contacted the Academy to request permission to cite it in ongoing studies about human behavioral profiles and threat assessment methodology. I heard that Vorith was asked about the clip by a colleague and responded, characteristically, with a single sentence. She answered correctly, "That is the purpose of the class." Which is Vorith for? It was exactly what I needed the class to see. I've revised my opinion slightly on whether it was planned. I think he knew a human would be a useful subject for this particular question, and he knew the question would be challenging. I do not think he expected the quality of the answer he got. I think, in his methodical and experienced way, he expected to expose a weakness and use it constructively. And instead, he got an education. We all did. There is a thing that happens at this academy. I've seen it before in smaller ways, where a single moment changes the social texture of a space. Not the formal structure. Nothing official. Just the way people look at each other or at a particular person when something has shifted that can't be unshifted. Myra Solis sat in the fourth row, left center, for the rest of the semester. She still participated when called on and went back to her notes when she wasn't. She still kept the braid that came loose by mid-morning. She still chose seats near exits. But the Meridian students in the upper rows, who had made that small sound of affirmation when Vorith listed human limitations, they stopped doing things like that. Not because of any formal conversation, just because they'd seen something, and now they knew something they hadn't known before. And Professor Vorith, for the rest of that semester, called on Myra Solis the same way he called on any student. No special treatment, no particular scrutiny. She was simply a cadet in his class, held to the same standard as everyone else. Which was, I came to understand, the highest compliment he was capable of giving. I want to end with something she said to me, not that day but later, near the end of the semester, when we had become the kind of people who nodded to each other in corridors and occasionally shared a table in the academic dining hall. We were talking about something else entirely, a simulation scenario from a different class. And she said something that stayed with me in the way things do when they're true, but you couldn't have said them yourself. We'd been discussing how difficult it was to assess risk in scenarios with too many unknown variables. How the instinct is always to simplify, to reduce the unknowns, to pick the most familiar framework and apply it and hope it holds. And she said, "The thing is, being unknown is not a disadvantage. It's a resource. The whole time someone is figuring out what you are, they're not doing anything else." She said it the same way she said everything, quietly, like an observation rather than a speech. Then she went back to her simulation notes. I kept turning it over in my head all the way home. Being unknown is not a disadvantage. It's a resource. I don't know if that's a human philosophy specifically, or just Myra Solis' philosophy. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe that's kind of the point. What I know for certain is this. I sat in Sigma 9 on the 43rd day of the autumn cycle, and I watched a species be dismissed, out loud, in front of 46 witnesses. I watched all of their history and all of their biology listed as shortcomings. I watched a single young woman, 20-something standard years, slight build, dark braid coming loose at the end, seated near the exit, stand up and take that list apart, piece by piece, with nothing but clear thinking and the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to be loud to take up the whole room. And I watched a professor with decades of military experience and a classroom built around the philosophy of pressure go completely still for 4 minutes. I have been a student at this academy for 3 years. I have seen a lot of things. But I have never, not before that day, and not since, seen 46 people from 22 different species all go quiet at the same time because one of them said something that made the air feel different. Humans have been in the galactic community for 60 years. They are underestimated constantly, cheerfully, almost universally. I think they know this. I think, somewhere quiet and practical in the back of every human mind, they've been filing that fact away. The way Myra Solis files things away. The way she sits near the exit. The way she watches. The way she waited 3 seconds and then said, "With respect, Professor, you've just made my argument for me. Some beings are dangerous because they are strong. Some because they are fast or armored or ancient. And some because they were never given a reason to believe the room could stop them. The galaxy is still learning which kind humans are. I already know.